Welcome to the JBU Stories podcast. I'm your host, Julie Gumm, Director of University Marketing and Communications at John Brown University. I'm also an alum and a current parent, so I get to see JBU from all sides. The heart of JBU is really our people, our students, alumni, faculty, and staff. The JBU Stories podcast is where we get to introduce you to these amazing people and hear their stories. Hey everybody, we hope you had a great weekend. Welcome back to another episode of JBU Stories podcast. This episode features my interview with Dr. Kevin Simpson, the head of our psychology department and one of our psychology professors here at JBU. He's taught psychology in a variety of universities for about 12 years, and we've actually gotten to know each other because our sons played high school soccer together, and Kevin is very interested in a subject that interests me. So actually my mom is a big World War II history buff. That's been an area of interest for her for a long time, and Kevin's research, a lot of it centers around the Holocaust. And so I've been fascinating to follow along with his academic research that he's doing and think this is such an important subject matter, really, because when you think about it, the youngest survivors of the Holocaust are about 74 or 75 years old today. And so that is a group of people that we are not going to have around too much longer. And so I think it's super important to have all the opportunities we can to hear their stories, to record those stories, and to pass those stories on to the next generation. So I hope you enjoy my interview with Kevin. Kevin, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and your relation to JBU?
Great. Well, I've actually been connected to this place for over 30 years now, which is kind of shocking to realize. Attended JBU, graduated late 80s, and played soccer here, and absolutely loved it. Ended up, in hindsight, seeing it as a life-altering decision, if that doesn't sound too dramatic, simply because went on to graduate school, a couple other places, but found my way back to JBU about 7 years ago when a position came open in psychology. So I had taught in Denver, Utah, for 12 years in Portland, Oregon, but made my way back to JBU. And it's been probably the best move we've ever made for our family. I feel so at home here. I feel like I'm growing as a professor, but it's been well over 30 years at this point, which is kind of daunting to think about.
Because we don't feel that old, do we?
No, of course. And they never grow older, right?
No.
The people we work with are always absolutely 18 to 23. So, yeah.
They do. Being around all the college kids is kind of one of the things that makes me feel old sometimes.
Yeah.
Generally, I don't. But
you wonder how they see you.
That and talking about times when we were at JBU and what
Right.
things were like, and then they just roll their eyes at us. But
Yep.
So you're a psychology professor, head of the psychology department, but one of your main academic research areas is the Holocaust. How do those two things fit and come together?
I think if you had asked me that question while I was in graduate school, I might have given you a blank stare with maybe some fumblings around history and psychology being, cousin disciplines. But it really became apparent to me as I taught social psychology over the years, where a lot of the examples we would use to illustrate concepts regarding prejudice and group behavior, altruism even, why people do good things when it's maybe not in their best interest or personal interest, constantly came back to examples from these major human events, genocide, but particularly the Holocaust. So it was probably a decade ago. I would have a lot of kind of after-class conversations with a really good friend of mine, historian at Concordia University in Portland, and we shared an interest in World War II history. That was his specialization. I grew up kind of fascinated with World War II. I think I'm of the generation that maybe glorified the war and its heroics. Nazis were always evil, of course, but started to realize that psychology has something unique to offer in terms of answering maybe some of the why questions.
Right.
Of course, history is good at filling in the details with what happened and some of the how questions, but psychology really speaks to human motivation, personality theory, this sort of stuff. So the why question was really compelling. So I felt it necessary for me to get up to speed to where the historians were. So I took a very formative seminar at the Holocaust Museum 10 years ago, actually this summer. And I'll talk about it a little bit later on in terms of why I teach the Holocaust. There was something that happened there the last week at the museum that was very striking, but very influential, very well-known historian from Northwestern University named Peter Hayes, who just opened up my eyes to how these fields can go together. And so I felt like I was getting the grounding I needed to be able to teach competently. But initially, I co-taught the course with the history colleague at Concordia, a different gentleman. But eventually, through self-study and the seminars, I felt like I could take on a course like this on my own. So eventually started to do that, and I actually used an aspect of this area when I did my interview at JBU back in 2012. So it was always kind of in my thinking, and for whatever reason, I became captivated by it. And it opened up again so many doors for travel, for meeting other scholars. In fact, we've got a gentleman that I developed a quick friendship with in Slovakia who we're hoping to bring to JBU as a Fulbright scholar in 21-22. So very excited about that. His name is Mikhail Vanek. So
very cool.
Excited to bring him. Big fella, tall fella, but excited to come here. So.
Yeah. So you had, in some of those early on years, you kind of mentioned it, you had some fellowships that you were able to do at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and a summer institute on the Holocaust and Jewish civilization. What was your primary goals in going into those? Were you doing specific research on specific topics within the Holocaust?
For the one through Northwestern University, that's the HEF fellowship. That again came just a couple of years after the one at the Holocaust Museum. And again, I felt like I was getting a more solid grounding in the areas of Holocaust literature, art, film even. In fact, the year after that, I did a Holocaust and film course in Portland. But it's a course actually I want to try to teach here. I've been talking with Professor Snedeker here at JBU, but there were some areas that still needed coverage for me in terms of exposure and literature and reading and that sort of thing. So that's what that did. But then there was a follow-up to that, kind of a secondary grant where I was able to travel to a lot of the Holocaust memorial sites. So in addition to having taken students to Auschwitz a couple of times, I visited Berlin, Warsaw, Krakow. We also ventured to some of the rural areas where the worst of the Holocaust occurred, especially in southeast Poland, and then ended up back in Vienna. So right before I came to JBU, I actually did a semester abroad teaching on the Holocaust in Vienna. And Austria has a really interesting story, kind of like Slovakia does, in terms of being very enthusiastic collaborators with the Nazis. But for me, I needed to see the places I felt like. I needed to kind of walk the grounds. Yeah. Many of the places are very sacred. I mean, a lot of people describe Auschwitz as a cemetery. So you walk through these places with a real sense of awe and trepidation, even because you know the stories that fill the spaces there.
Yeah, it's definitely very, my husband and I had a chance to go to Sachsenhausen in Germany, and it's a very sacred experience to walk on those grounds and read the stories and see the photographs and yeah, very sobering. So you had all this time, and then in 2016, you published your first book, Soccer Under the Swastika. So you got to combine two of your passions now.
I did, unexpectedly.
Yeah, tell us, how did the spark for that book start?
Well, I put together a paper for a conference. It was actually a soccer conference where I was writing about one particular ghetto camp, and it was just north of Prague, a place called Terezín. The Nazis called it Theresienstadt. And basically it was a place that was set up to be a facade of sorts. In other words, this is a place where the Jews supposedly were being treated well, like a refugee center, but in fact it was a way station, the stopping off point before Auschwitz for many Jews, especially Jews from Western Europe. These, again, were Jews who were going to be missed. They're very famous in the sciences and culture. But in this camp, beyond all of the other thousands of other camps and ghettos across Europe, there existed three levels of soccer, a pro level, an amateur level, and a youth level. And we know the most about the soccer in these places. So I put together this paper, and at the conference, after presenting, bumped into a book publisher, an editor who asked me, have you ever thought about maybe doing a book level project on this? And that hadn't crossed my mind because I was doing this one-off sort of project. But every time I would prep for my courses, both in Portland and even here at JBU, I kept coming across photographs and memoir accounts, people who played in these places. And I was shocked by that because, of course, these places are meant to destroy, to starve, to murder. And the most compelling photo that I remember seeing early on were of these prisoners maybe 3 months after Dachau opened near Munich, and they're kicking a ball around this dusty field. And you quickly realize, well, this is a Nazi propaganda photograph that they put into local newspapers. But there was something else there. So the more I dug, the more I learned. And again, the kind of tricky aspect of this is that for many of the survivors, they didn't really talk about this much after the war, because to have played in these places and maybe gotten extra rations or protection or privilege was was seen maybe as something you didn't want to talk about too publicly.
Right.
Of course, the question would immediately come up, what about those who perished, who, of course, were not part of that privileged class? And there was one testimony account of what was going on in Terezin, where this youth player who loved the game, like, a lot of boys and girls, they're just crazy about whatever sport or activity they find when they're young. He remembered talking about or remembering the players, and they represented life and vitality and even virility. Surprisingly, these were healthy young men who could still play their sport well. Many of them played professionally before their incarceration or their encampment or their imprisonment, and for them, they represented hope. They represented, hopefully, a future that could be realized after the war was over. So it was symbolic, but it was also real. These players represented something that, of course, had been taken from them if they were in these places as well. So yeah.
Was there, the guards and stuff at the camp, they were actually organizing these leagues and promoting these games and that sort of stuff. Yeah. And I think it was, I don't remember if it was an article or your book that I read that talked about how, they used it but the prisoners who were playing, it was also kind of like a little form of rebellion.
It was, very
for
much
them.
so, yeah. There were other activities in the camp that allowed prisoners to voice their resistance. In fact, in Terezin, there's a very famous story of a conductor, a Prague composer named Raphael Schachter. And in fact, one of the fellowships I attended was devoted to his honor, where they created what was called the Defiant Requiem, and they used Verdi's Mass, Verdi's Requiem, which is in Latin. The prisoners learned it, and of course the composition of the choir changed as people were deported and frankly sent to their deaths. But they sung it to Latin one time to their Nazi captors. It was during a Red Cross visit, and when you look at the Latin lyrics, it's a condemnation of the evil in the world, that there's going to be a reckoning. It's remarkable they pulled this off. But sport represented this as well. The most maybe well-known example is boxing, where you might have a German and a Polish boxer in the ring, prisoners, but they'd be battling it out. And it's a way, again, to get a little revenge, frankly, for the cruelty, for the inhumanity of it all. Football, though, you would have nationalities playing each other. There were, of course, leagues in other camps, but Terezin's the most well-known one. In fact, when I was in Slovakia this spring, I did a lecture at the Mauthausen camp to the staff there, where we're learning a lot more about the soccer that happened there. And originally it started with the Spanish prisoners who were sent there, who were fighting Franco during the Spanish Civil War. And these prisoners, again, almost immediately, because they weren't Jews, which again put them in a different class, they set up a league, and again, you got extra protection, you got extra rations. Sometimes the SS were betting on the games as well. So it was a way, again, to keep yourself alive. Sadly, though, you could get an injury, a serious injury, and you might be put on the next transport because you don't serve the purposes of the leadership. So
you've talked a little bit about specific stories and stuff. Was there a single person that you learned a lot about in your research for that book that really stood out to you?
Actually, there's a gentleman named Emory Cortez. He's, if I'm not mistaken, a Nobel laureate. He's a survivor, a Holocaust survivor, and he's most known for his memory of the Holocaust in Czech literature in particular. But he was a younger, adolescent young man, and he talked about how, in fact, it's one of the quotes I have in the book that talks about what soccer represented to those in those moments. And for him, he talks about soccer. It's called internationally, the beautiful game, for good reason, that there's a flow to it, that creativity and spontaneity, of course, is rewarded. But in this place, again, of ultimate suffering, it represented, again, an aesthetic, a beauty that could kind of counter the atrocity that's constantly surrounded them. There are stories of people coming to watch these games by the thousands, especially in Terezin. And
so, people living nearby, just civilians?
No, in the camp.
Oh, in the camp.
Because it was a ghetto city. It had walls
so the other prisoners would all come. And
And you'd have to have tickets sometimes for the big matches. But there's one story of people who were part of the death detail, frankly, where they'd have to take out bodies that had maybe perished the night before, and they'd set the stretcher down to watch this particular match, and then they pick the stretcher up at the end and can resume with their duties. Right. Just a powerful kind of reminder that, unfortunately, in the Nazi sphere, death marched on.
Yeah. Okay, so you received a Fulbright U.S. scholar grant for teaching in fellowship for the 2018-19 school year. It was actually last spring. So you spent basically February through May in Bratislava, Slovakia. Did I do that okay?
You got it right.
So why Slovakia? Why did you choose that as the place that you wanted to go to?
I've gotten this question a lot, and I think it's because people confuse Slovakia with Slovenia and a number of other countries in the east there, Eastern Europe. But the more honest, more direct answer is that when you really kind of get beyond the major characters, the Nazi Germany's, France, England, U.S., Russia, Slovakia played a particularly devastating role early on. They were part of the former Czechoslovakia, and again, I won't give you the all complicated long answer here, but Slovakia represents collaboration at its worst, and the peculiar twist for me was that they were led by a Catholic priest, a guy named Joseph Tiso, who was very nationalistic, very committed to his faith. In fact, early on in his career, very motivated by issues of poverty, social justice, this kind of stuff. But once it became apparent that Slovakia could have been easily gobbled up either by the Communist East or by Nazi Germany, he tried to negotiate a middle ground, and in doing so, was a very early collaborator. So it's the only instance, for instance, where a country who collaborated with the Nazis actually paid for their Jews to be deported. So they actually deported them and then also had to pay 500 Reichsmarks. So for me, that was really compelling, not a very well-known story, and I want to understand that a bit more because when I teach on the Holocaust, I'm very interested in having my students understand what it means to be a bystander, whether it's a modern issue today or, again, in these fateful times. So for me, Slovakia was a nice add-on to my time that I spent in Vienna. Vienna is a 45-minute train ride away. So very different, though, because they were under the yoke of communism. So for me, I was just fascinated. Had never visited. I mean, that was kind of a curious thing to, make a proposal to a country you've never been before. But I did my homework. I did my research and absolutely loved it. Felt like I was better connected to the culture and the people than I was in Vienna when I was there several years ago because we were more kind of self-contained as a U.S. group. So that's part of the reason why I think I was able to develop some good friendships with faculty there.
Yeah. So we'll talk about the classes you taught in a little bit, but let's talk about what kind of research were you kind of focused on trying to get done while you were there? I know you did a lot of traveling, that sort of thing.
The research was actually secondary because it was exclusively a teaching fellowship. So my expectation was to do well in the classroom. So I taught sports psychology and then psychology of the Holocaust. But in my preparations for the Holocaust course, I came across one line in a fairly recent encyclopedia of camps and ghettos. This is put out by the Holocaust Museum in D.C. And this one line I highlighted, held on to it, and I knew I would come back to it because I thought this would be a conversation to open up when I get there. And so the one line mentioned that in 1940-41, about 250 Jewish laborers helped build a soccer stadium. And this, again, didn't happen that often. Yes, there were labor camps all over Europe, but to build a soccer stadium, this caught my eye. So it's a little factoid in there. And I thought, okay, I need to travel to this stadium. It's up in the northwest. It's actually on the route between Bratislava and Auschwitz. I mean, it seems like every train route ends up there, unfortunately, when you talk about this history. But it was the last transit stop before, in fact, Poland. And it was a work camp associated with it and was only open for a few months, a few years. And visited the stadium, went to a match. It was a chilly February day. Walked around and realized this is the same grandstand that was built in 1942. And apparently a Jewish survivor back in the 90s tried to pursue a memorial plaque, and it didn't get anywhere because at that time it was a much more nationalistic reason. The prime minister I was talking about, Tiso, I'm sorry, the president back in the day, he's from this area. So it still, again, has a more conservative sort of bent to it. But I was shocked to see the stand still there. They had updated, and it was a full 360-degree stadium, but these concrete stands were still there. So I thought this is worth pursuing a little farther. So
let's talk about that.
I guess in a brash American sort of way, I had done again some more due diligence, but I sent a letter to the president of the club. There's just one gentleman who owns the team. And asked, hey, did you know this history? Here's some additional research we found out since maybe a few years ago. Would you be open to a meeting? And I got a pretty quick reply, met with him, and I think he had already made up his mind to do the plaque before we had met.
Had he known the history of that?
He did, yeah.
Okay.
But there was enough recent information through testimonies and a few other documents that it felt more reliable, basically, the information that was coming forward. Before I met with him, though, I want to say that I carefully consulted with the Jewish community leader there in this town called Jelena, and then also some historians. So I wasn't just, again, floating this balloon to pursue my own goal here.
Right.
But I was pleasantly surprised. Very gracious man. He spoke English, thankfully. And within a month, we got a plaque fabricated back in Bratislava. They took it up and installed it, and we had, about 2 weeks before my departure, the dedication ceremony. So I had people praying for it. I put this in my blog, so people were tuned into this back home in the States, and it just came along. But there were, I think, enough people had done enough work earlier that I was kind of
they set some of the groundwork and for that. So,
but it had stayed kind of without any momentum for probably 20 years. I just came along at the right time, I think.
Yeah. And then there was press coverage from the dedication ceremony. I know
cool.
we got a little alert from a Slovakian news channel or whatever. I didn't understand a word they said, but there was you.
Because again, it was so interesting. I think of it somewhat providentially in that there were enough people who were connected to this project, in the local footballing community, the Jewish community, historians, that the word got out. And Slovakia is not a very big country. My friend Mikhail talks about Bratislava as kind of being a small town in that regard. But a little side note to this, it's probably mid-February. The weather was starting to clear up, and winters are cold in Central Europe. But I was focused on finding some pickup soccer on Saturday. So I walked some neighborhoods, some fields where I thought I might find a game, and lo and behold, I found some older gentlemen about my age playing pickup soccer in this small kind of court. It was like futsal. It was beautiful. And they took a chance on me. I said, hey, can I play? One or two of them spoke English, and I could show that I could still play at my advanced age. And I got invited back. So I played all spring with them. But the guy who I initially met was actually a sports broadcaster back in Bratislava. So he was one of the kind of communication points to the other news networks, along with the Fulbright Foundation there as well. So it was just interesting, these little connections.
God kind of providentially brings these little people in your path.
And I found out a week ago that Mikhail was interviewed by his wife. So this sports broadcaster's wife is a journalist about our potential, I'll talk about this later, potential exhibit project we're going to do next summer. I don't know if I told you about this, but based on my book, but also the Slovak stories that we're starting to learn more about. We're going to hopefully open in next June a Soccer Under the Swastika exhibit there. Mikhail's going to take the lead. He works for the Museum of Jewish Culture. So very exciting. I might go back actually this winter to work on the project.
Yeah.
Do some research.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about, you taught 2 classes while you were there at, and I kind of forget the name of the university. Comenius. Okay.
Comenius University.
What were those classes? Are those classes that you teach at JBU?
They were.
Okay.
Yeah, they were adapted. So, in fact, I had to kind of simplify them, partly because of the language challenge. I was working actually with graduate students who spoke English at least as a second language. Some of them spoke 3 or 4 languages, I learned later. But sports psychology was one.
Okay.
I tried to make that really applied. So a lot of what we were working on were practical, skill-based kinds of things. Some of them were coaches. Some of them were former athletes. Some were just interested in the topic and wanted to hear an American teach it. And then psychology of the Holocaust, which was much more closely modeled on the course I taught here. But all the prep I did had to bring forward pre-war and during the war, the histories there that were unique to Slovakia, because Slovakia, again, early on collaborated pretty intensely, and then around 1944, when the Soviets were coming, flipped and resisted. So the Nazis actually came in and occupied. So that's more the heroic story that many Slovaks remember, is that resistance, because thousands gave of their lives, but the greater story, frankly, is the collaboration. That's a hard one to wrestle with.
And how is that? Because, when we talk about the Holocaust here in the U.S., we weren't directly. I mean, yes, we had
liberators.
people. We're liberators.
Yeah,
exactly. So we weren't experiencing that. We get to play the hero a little bit. We're not part of the evil side of that. So how are the students? How did they react to those?
Well, they're the grandchildren
stories, right?
And when you talk about that third generation, they're more likely to ask the harder questions. This is even true in places like Germany and Austria. So for many of them, they had heard some of the glorious accounts, the resistance. They maybe had a grandparent who was involved in some way. But what they've wrestled with in the years since are the same pressures that we've dealt with, I think, as a country in terms of what to do with new immigrant groups, economic pressures, all of that. And fundamentally, they were aware of some of the collaboration, but it had been downplayed. For many of them, what they're more likely to tune into is the communist era because it lasted so much longer.
Right.
And so what you get is a different kind of revisionism of the World War II era, but also the communist era. And for many of them, they're more affected, frankly, by the communists. Their parents lived through it, and on occasion, it's usually the older generation. They'll reflect more glowingly on that era as less complicated. It's the strangest thing because as an American hearing that, I'm thinking, do you not realize what you'd missed? And of course they did. But,
right.
They tend to be more impacted by the communists. So some of them were aware of the kind of rise of the right wing. This is true throughout Europe, and that's more of what they're tuned into. In fact, there's a right-wing party that's adopted some of the fascist symbolism of that era. What was called the Linke Guard was the equivalent of the SS, and they were the ones who'd run the camps and deport people. And there's kind of a revival of that in some circles, especially more conservative, traditionalist areas in Slovakia.
So what else, like, from your time there was really impactful? I know you had visiting time. You had lots of time to go to soccer matches. You met up with some JBU alumni, actually, even too. Like, what were some of the other, like, just outside of the classroom or your research times that kind of impacted you?
I was able to travel, and it's so strange, frankly. The traveling is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe in a cheeky sort of way called Holocaust tourism. Because I was so close to Ukraine, I had a JBU connection there, a missions family who works with special needs families there. And through this student, I asked, hey, would your parents be open? And she invited me, actually. She grew up in Kiev. And so February, I took a trip to Kiev and toured some of the Holocaust sites. The Holocaust was particularly brutal there. But what was a nice kind of balance to that is the other opportunities to travel in Europe, Budapest, Stephanie, my wife, came to visit during spring break, so we got to go to Greece. That was a highlight. It was kind of a second honeymoon sort of thing. That was really wonderful. That was a nice break because you get so immersed in suffering that these breaks are nice. And then toward the end, got to go to Ireland as well for the first time. So these little breaks in between. But in country, I think the things that were most impactful were the day-to-day relationships. So I developed a nice friendship with my colleague. She actually shared her office with me. She teaches counseling, clinical sort of areas, and she's an expert in an area called Adlerian psychology. Adler was a kind of a colleague or a cohort of Freud's back in the day, and we're actually going to design another study abroad, Dr. Lanker and I, in theology, to go back to Switzerland and take part of our group to Vienna and Bratislava now, and she's going to do a workshop for us. So I think what I enjoyed most were those times where I could get to know the colleagues better, meals together. Spent Easter with her and her family. It was just wonderful. So I felt like I wasn't so isolated. But traveled enough. Again, some of it was, soccer related, traveling to more rural parts. But early on, a trip to the north. I don't know if people don't know Slovakia, but there's an area in the north with the border with Poland called the Tatras, the high and low Tatras mountains. And they're beautiful. They're as beautiful as anything I've seen in Colorado or even the Alps, surprisingly. So people can never make it to that little corner of Europe. I highly recommend it. It's staggeringly beautiful.
So besides teaching here at JBU, you're very involved. You do visiting lectures, various places, workshops, conferences on the Holocaust. And you even do some stuff. You work with a conference here in Arkansas that kind of focuses on high school students and teaching them about the Holocaust. Why do you think that's so important for us to expand on? Because, our kids get it in a blip, in their history classes in college, to expand on that with our young adults.
What we love about doing this annual conference, it's usually November, early or later October, but the people who started it were educators. So they were in the high schools and middle schools, and they realized there was such a gap in the way we taught this history that this was a great way to bring survivors forward and have them tell their stories. And of course, we're coming to the end of the age of the survivors, so the stories are more and more rare to hear. But they, again, welcomed me very early on. I found out who they were when I first started here and started attending their meetings. But the students never fail us. When you hear the questions they ask of survivors after a survivor talk or after a session on propaganda or Holocaust memoir testimony, they never fail us. They're curious about this history. They may not know much about it, but for them, it's the narrative that really captures them. And so if they can read even beyond an Anne Frank or Elie Wiesel, they start to realize that these stories resonate in a way that I don't think will ever diminish. Now, our memory of the events may diminish. We may get farther and farther away. That's one thing I worry about. We might as well be talking about, the American Revolution. Sometimes it seems so remote to them, but the students never fail us, and they're genuinely curious, and they want to understand how this could happen, why they learn eventually that ordinary people were involved. It wasn't just, the evil Nazi. And for them, it's through the storytelling. The other thing I would add is that the contemporary issues of division, how to approach difference, these show up very readily in the history of the Holocaust. And again, for me as a Christian, it's compelling to talk about the origins of anti-Semitism in Christianity, but to also talk about what people did during the war to fight that atrocity. We talk about the rescuers, certainly, but the people who were resistors through their faith. Bonhoeffer's the most maybe famous example. But for us as educators, the issues don't necessarily change that much. I mean, why we're maybe afraid of an immigrant group coming from Syria or something. Our JBU students were addressing that a few months ago. These issues don't seem to go away.
Right.
They're always present, it seems.
And you've actually, so a couple of years ago, you and Tricia Posey, who is one of our history professors and director of our honors program, you guys developed a honors colloquium course. Did I even say that right? Called Becoming Evil? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that class and what you guys were kind of trying to accomplish with that. Because it's outside your normal, psychology department or history department. Right. It was any of the honor students. The
primary reader we use for that course is actually written by a social psychologist who's one of the foremost genocide experts. And the reason why we thought this course would be great to develop together is that our students, especially in the honors program, they come from different discipline areas, a few from psychology, history, English, all of that. And for us, it was a way to address an aspect of the fall, but also redemption. When, for instance, you consider the theoretical explanations, the research we have to explain why ordinary people get involved. Waller's book does a great job of that, and coincidentally, he's actually a believer himself. He's a professing Christian, but he gets right at the heart of why killing, when it happens on this scale, is almost always a one-to-one sort of enterprise. And for students to wrap their head around that, that's a tricky proposition. We know about gas chambers, we know about mass shootings, but you start to look at the one-to-one killing, for instance, in Rwanda, and that staggers the imagination. What is it about human nature that allows us to have that vulnerability? So the redemptive side of it showed up really well in our recent trip to Guatemala. So we taught the course for the second time, I think, last fall. And we talked about potential study abroad weekend. We did it over fall break. And it's because we have the wonderful connection of Joe Walenchek on campus here to Guatemala. But there's a group called FAFG. It's a Guatemalan NGO that does forensic work. So they'll exhume mass graves, do the DNA analysis, and identify people who'd been missing. And there were thousands, something like 40,000 missing after the Guatemalan Civil War. So long story short, we can look at redemption as it plays out in the court systems. We can look at it on the one-to-one when a family can claim a missing family member and maybe have a proper burial and a remembrance of that person. So probably the most moving experience we had last October was to stand over a mass grave and have not necessarily a specific remembrance ceremony, but a more general one to think about what happened in this place. It was a former military base, and to also look across the grounds and see the memorial that the FAFG had put up. So we went to their labs in Guatemala City. A very humbling experience because they had skeletons out on the table they were identifying, which included a couple of children. So a very moving experience. But it's a way, again, to look at the worst of humanity, but also these efforts to try to redeem it, to see how God is working through a justice system that sometimes doesn't work well in places like Guatemala. So
Yeah, there's a article talks more about that trip in the Impact academic journal that we do. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. It's a really good article. And we got some pictures and stuff too. So obviously, the Holocaust, and it's not the only subject, but it's a really tough subject. I mean, you even talked about kind of needing that break, when you were in Slovakia. And a lot of people, I think, shy away, because they're just like, I can't deal with it.
Right.
Like, that's too heavy. I don't want to watch that film, or I don't want to read that book, or I don't want to go to that lecture.
Yeah.
What do you tell people who kind of come back with that?
Suck it up. No, not really. I'm kidding. I'm completely kidding. What we try to do, I think, in the way I think about Holocaust education, but also genocide education, is that there are going to be different entry points, and some people might shy away. We don't want to make them uncomfortable. We don't want to put this in their face and demand their attention. But honestly, without, again, trying to apply a guilt trip here, part of the reason why evil runs amok is that too many people are indifferent. And so for me, the theme that I come back to in these courses is the bystander effect. What makes it so easy for us to turn a blind eye? Sometimes there's a threat, there's a danger to us. If you're living in these times, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say, why didn't you do something different? But it's just too easy, I think, to turn a blind eye. I mean, in many ways, I'm talking to myself because I can easily tune out what's happening in places like Syria or Burma,
you feel
South
kind of helpless.
Sudan.
Like,
sure,
what
can
I do?
Yeah, it's 6,000 miles away.
Yeah.
One of the things that was very impactful, there's a gentleman named Sam Totten over at U of A. He's a retired prof there, but he does humanitarian work in Sudan. In fact, to great risk to himself, he'll sneak in aid supplies, rice, beans, this sort of stuff. And the most recent trip that he did this, he actually had to be medevaced out. But our first Holocaust Honors Colloquium group met with him, and he did a nice little lecture about what he does. And it led to one of those students actually studying genocide at the grad level over at U of A. Wow. So for a few students, this can be really impactful stuff longer term. But our hope is that just people will be tuned in to what's going on around them. Again, myself included, it's easy to tune this stuff out.
Yeah. You kind of hinted at something, so we're going to come back to it. You had an experience during one of those fellowships at the U.S. Holocaust Museum that kind of drives a lot of what you got into. You want to tell us about that? Yeah,
again, I don't mean to be melodramatic with this, but it was profound. So it was a 2-week seminar. By the second week, we were very familiar with our setting, each other. The discussions were flowing really well, and each midday point, about 12, we'd break for lunch. There'd be a catered lunch brought in. It was all very nice. But one particular day is probably 12:20. We're running a little late. Discussion carried on. We hear this pop, pop, pop. And 2 or 3 of the people who had a police background jumped up. Not an alarm, but they immediately started to assess the situation. The others of us were just kind of looking around thinking what's going on. It sounded like a metal cart was going down the stairs. And it very quickly became apparent to us that something had happened at the front door of the museum. So very quickly, doors were locked. We were huddled under tables. People were trying to get in our room. That was kind of strange that we would just keep the door locked. But of course, this is what you do when you're locked down. This is what you do. Yeah, this is. And we learned pretty quickly that white supremacists who had an online presence of hate basically had walked up to the front door with a long rifle and shot into the glass. The man who opened the door for him, thinking he was a guest, was named Stephen Johns, was shot. So we were there for probably an hour, eventually made our way back to our hotel. We were processing, kind of decompressing. But as we came out of the subway stop to walk to our hotel, we passed the hospital where both gunman and guard were being ambulanced in. And what was striking about it was the kind of, again, this sounds a little corny, but it's genuine. The rainbow of colors of people helping the white supremacist to try to save his life. And they did save his life for a time. He died a few months later because he was 89 and was in poor health. But it was just a reminder. And this was the first time this had happened. The museum had been open for probably 16 years at that point. Yeah. First, and this is a while ago, too. I mean, we've kind of gotten so used to this. But back then, even 10 years ago, these these shootings that are kind of seem all too common now, they were much more rare. But. Yeah. And so the guard lost his life. He had helped us each day to come in, put us through the metal detector, which is still there. But I passed by actually just on Friday afternoon. There's a picture of Stephen John's in memoriam with a bit of blurb, a little narrative of what happened that day. But it had such an impact on me that I dedicated my book actually to him because of the impact there. So
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about this. I wish I had more time. I could take your classes. But speaking of that. Oh, okay.
This is not a plug necessarily, but as a way to kind of talk about counterbalance. Again, when students are interested in psychology, we talk about the different elective sort of options. One balance to that will be the course on the psychology of genius that I get to teach this fall, and I'm very excited about that. I haven't taught that in I think 4 or 5 years. So it's a way again to look at the best of humanity across again literature, science, culture, and so on. So these are necessary options, and I've been grateful to JBU. I've had the freedom to delve into these topics very deeply, and the support to go travel and do a Fulbright as I did last spring. So I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, and Kevin's done a couple other podcasts, so we'll link to those on the show notes page, and articles and books and all of that sort of stuff. So thanks so much for being on.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of JBU Stories. Visit jbu.edu/stories for a transcript of today's show, links, and show notes. Be sure to subscribe to JBU Stories on iTunes, and we'd love it if you would leave us a review.